Imagine your life is going its normal course. You're young, dreaming of the future and making plans. You're traveling to visit friends, full of hope and confidence. But one mistake, trusting strangers, changes everything. Colleen Stan, a 20-year-old young woman, embarks on a short journey, unaware that her life is about to change forever. She gets into a car with a couple, Cameron and Janice Hooker, who seem like ordinary people at first glance. Girl in the Box, 2016, tells the real and shocking story based on events from 1977. Colleen, having accepted a ride from strangers, falls into a trap from which escape seems impossible. She is taken to the Hooker's home and locked in a wooden box, which begins as a nightmare transforms into a test of her inner strength and will to survive. The story follows two children of a broken military family who live within the family's home. This movie plunges the viewer into a grim and hard reality where every minute becomes a struggle to preserve oneself. It is a story about human resilience, the limits that a person can overcome, and how the will to survive can overcome fear. Colleen Stan, the protagonist of Girl in the Box, 2016, is a young woman whose life, at first glance, is no different from that of her peers. She is cheerful, energetic, and full of dreams. But everything changes in an instant when her life turns into a living nightmare. A fateful encounter with Cameron and Janice Hooker transforms her world into an unending horror. Cameron and Janice strip her of her familiar world, imprisoning her in a wooden box where her days and nights blur into monotonous suffering. They seek to break her will, turning her into a silent captive. However, Colleen possesses an inner strength they cannot destroy. Despite the fear and pain, she clings to hope, which becomes her salvation. Colleen's motivation is to survive despite the inhuman conditions. Her will to live is sustained by the memories of her family and the dreams she cherished before her abduction. Each day in captivity becomes a test of her resilience, where every step she takes is an attempt to preserve herself and her identity. Colleen also realizes that her captors are attempting to manipulate her mind, instilling fear and hopelessness. But she learns to use their rules to her advantage, adapting and waiting for the right moment to break free. Her motivation is not only to survive, but also to preserve her spirit, becoming the core of her struggle. The environment in Girl in the Box becomes an important part of the narrative, reinforcing the sense of horror and hopelessness. Much of the story unfolds in Cameron and Janice Hooker's home, isolated from the outside world. This house is a symbol of suppression and control, a place where Colleen is forced to spend her days in a wooden box that has become her prison. The box itself, cramped, devoid of air and light, becomes not only a physical but also a psychological instrument of torture. It narrows her world down to a minimum, forcing Colleen to struggle with claustrophobia, despair, and loneliness. Even when she is released from the box, the restrictions remain. Every corner of the house reminds her of her captivity. Years pass in this confined space, where days and nights merge into an endless struggle to keep her sanity. Cameron Hooker is a cold-blooded manipulator whose actions are driven by sadistic fantasies. He portrays himself as omnipotent and ruthless, convincing Colleen that she has no chance of escape. His manipulation and psychological pressure are aimed at breaking her will. Cameron creates the illusion of authority by claiming to act on behalf of a non-existent organization that supposedly controls her fate. This lie becomes a powerful tool to keep her in fear. Janice Hooker is a character caught between being a victim and an accomplice. Having endured years of abuse at her husband's hands, she has become passive and submissive. Cameron promises Janice that by using Colleen, he will no longer demand she fulfill his fantasies, putting her in a morally ambiguous position. However, Janice feels guilt over her involvement in Colleen's captivity. Gradually, she begins to recognize the horror of the situation, creating an internal conflict. Her fear of Cameron clashes with her desire to make things right. The central conflict of Girl in the Box, in 2016, revolves around Colleen's fight for survival and her sanity in the inhumane conditions created by Cameron and Janice Hooker. This struggle is not only physical but also psychological, as Colleen fights to preserve her identity and spirit despite constant pressure and manipulation. Cameron seeks to completely subjugate Colleen by using methods of psychological terror. He creates an illusion for her that her life is in the hands of a powerful organization that watches her every move. This lie causes Colleen not only to fear for herself, but also for her family, whom Cameron threatens if she dares to resist. Cameron also tries to break her through isolation and incarceration, limiting her ability to think and act. Colleen, despite all this, does not give up. She adapts to the situation by pretending to be submissive in order to gain at least minimal trust from Cameron and Janice. Colleen's internal conflict lies in finding the balance between waiting tactics and preparing for a possible escape. Her ability to maintain control over her emotions becomes key to her survival. Another important aspect of the conflict is the dynamic between Colleen and Janice. Janice, herself under Cameron's pressure, is at first seen as his accomplice, but gradually her inner disconnect becomes visible. She begins to sympathize with Colleen, though she remains hostage to her fear of her husband. This triangle of relationships creates a complex tension. Colleen sees Janice as a potential ally, but cannot trust her. As the plot progresses, Colleen begins to see Cameron's weaknesses and use them to her advantage. She realizes that his omnipotent power is built on fear and manipulation rather than real strength. Her inner resistance turns into a survival strategy that leads to the climax of trying to gain her freedom. The climax of Girl in the Box 2016 comes when Colleen realizes that her survival depends on whether she can break Cameron's psychological pressure and use his weaknesses to her advantage. Her struggle for freedom reaches its highest point when circumstances are such that she is faced with the choice of continuing to obey or risking everything for a chance to escape. The crisis escalates as the tension between Cameron and Janice reaches a peak. Janice, torn between fear of her husband and sympathy for Colleen, finally decides to go against Cameron. Colleen realizes that her chances of salvation depend on whether she can convince Janice to help her. This moment becomes a test of her ability to not only survive, but to find allies in the most unpredictable circumstances. In this moment, Colleen faces an internal conflict. Her fear of punishment and the possibility of failure fights her instinct for freedom. She realizes that her continued submission means the ultimate loss of herself as a person. Colleen decides that she can no longer allow Cameron to control her life and springs into action. Her plan is to use the disagreement between Cameron and Janice to sow more distrust and thus weaken their alliance. Colleen starts with small steps, showing Janice that she too is a victim and appealing to her feelings. Gradually, she convinces Janice that Cameron will never stop being a threat to either her or Colleen. The climax leads to the long-awaited resolution. Colleen, taking advantage of her captor's moment of weakness, gains her freedom. Janice, finally determined to confront Cameron, becomes a key element in the rescue plan. She secretly helps Colleen get out of the house, providing her with an escape from a nightmare that has lasted years. Colleen, despite her fear and physical weakness, shows incredible determination. She escapes, overcoming her fear of Cameron's threats and the illusions he has created to control her. This moment becomes for her a symbol of her victory over not only her captors, but also her inner fear and despair. When Colleen finally gains her freedom, she immediately turns to the authorities for help. Her testimony leads to Cameron's arrest, and his tyranny comes to an end. For Colleen, this is not just a rescue, but an opportunity to begin the process of rebuilding, putting the years she spent in captivity behind her. However, her struggle doesn't end there. Freedom is just the beginning of a new chapter where she must deal with the trauma her captors have left behind. Cameron is brought to trial and his actions are given due credit by the law. Janice, though she was his accomplice, serves as a witness for the prosecution, which helps bring justice to the end of this case. For Colleen, this moment is not only a physical release, but also an emotional victory. She proves that the human spirit can endure even the most brutal of trials. Her rescue becomes an important message for anyone facing inhumane circumstances. Hope, strength, and belief in oneself can turn despair into victory. After her release, Colleen begins the difficult journey of recovery and a return to normalcy. Her years in captivity have left deep scars, both physical and emotional, but her incredible resilience helps her take the first steps toward healing. She is no longer a victim. She is a survivor, someone who has managed to overcome the darkness and return to the light. Colleen realizes that her survival is the result of her inner strength, strategic thinking, and an overwhelming desire to live. Her experiences force her to reevaluate her values and outlook on life. She begins to appreciate even the simplest joys, the freedom to choose where to be, and the opportunity to be herself. In parallel, Colleen becomes a symbol of resilience for others. Her story inspires many people facing hardship, reminding them that even in the most desperate situations, hope can be found. She decides to use her experience to help others by sharing her story, participating in events to help victims of violence, and raising public awareness about the importance of fighting such crimes. At the same time, the Cameron and Janice trial becomes an important milestone not only for her, but also for the legal system. The case raises questions about the complex psychological relationship between kidnappers and victims, causing many to rethink their attitudes toward such crimes. Cameron receives a punishment commensurate with his crimes, and Janice, who spoke out against him, also faces the consequences of her role in the story. For Colleen, freedom means not only physical deliverance but also the opportunity to rebuild her life. She no longer sees herself only as a victim. Her story becomes an example of how a person can survive and grow, even through unspeakable trials. The final scene shows her at a simple activity, perhaps taking a walk outdoors or socializing with loved ones, which emphasizes how far she has come from the darkness she found herself in. Girl in the Box leaves viewers with a sense of unease but also inspiration. It's a story of how even in the most dire of circumstances, the human spirit can overcome incredible adversity. Colleen, after going through this terrible ordeal, comes out of it stronger than she was. Colleen Stan's story in Girl in the Box makes you wonder, what would you do in her shoes? Would you have been able to keep faith in yourself while under complete physical and emotional duress? How far would you be willing to go to survive when it seems like all paths to freedom are blocked? Colleen found the strength to fight back and take even the slightest chance to escape. And would you have been able to trust someone like Janice, whose role in your imprisonment remains ambiguous while in captivity? Could you forgive or at least understand those who played a part in your suffering if this was your only chance for release? This movie asks difficult but important questions. What are the limits of human resilience? What resources can we find within ourselves to overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges? And what does society need to do to ensure that stories like this one never happen again? Share your thoughts. Perhaps your answer will inspire someone else to fight for their salvation.